Hello all. Today I'm going to be doing a video on the books that I intend on reading this year, or at least the first 8 books that I intend on reading this year. Um, to be honest, it's not a lot of books, but it might take me the entire year to read them because they are pretty thick and pretty pregnant with thought, pretty dense, pretty turgid in some instances. Um, so first we've got Plato, The Collected Dialogues. Now, this book is one that is, in my opinion, is culturally important to the Western civilization, as is Shakespeare's plays or the King James Bible. His ideas have been extremely influential on our civilization, whether in the ancient world or in the 20th century. So, the reason I'm beginning with Plato, obviously, well, at least it's obvious in this when I tell you that this is going to be entirely philosophical reading list. I mean, of course, the works are going to cover different topics, whether it be ethics, metaphysics, politics, etc., but it's going to be a philosophical reading list. So, next up I have the basic works of Aristotle, and of course Aristotle was Plato's star pupil, and he was the teacher of Alexander the Great and the teacher of many, many ages of Western man, whether the Middle Ages, where he was very assiduously studied by the scholastics, and much of philosophy was predicated upon Aristotle's organon, or his logic, and classical logic is founded by Aristotle, and really Aristotle's been the textbook for logic up until the 19th century, when formal logic or mathematical logic made its appearance, and logic became quite different. Although Aristotle's logic has never been refuted, it's just been expanded upon by mathematical principles. So, and of course other works of Aristotle, whether you're speaking of his Politics, which has been very influential and was a textbook even for the young officers of the British Empire, and even today, I mean, it's studied at the university level by political science majors. So I could go on and on about it, but I'm trying to keep this as brief as possible, so I'm just going to cover a few topics for each book or each author. So next up I have the essential philosophical works of David Hume. David Hume, pretty much one of the major, if not the major, empirical philosophers of the 18th century, empiricist rather. And the empiricist, of course, believed that most, if not all, of our knowledge is derived from experience, unlike the rationalists who believed in innate ideas, or that we're born with certain ideas in our mind, etc., etc. And the one who united the two schools of thought comes next, and that being Immanuel Kant, Prolegomena to Any Future Metaphysics. Kant said Hume awakened him from his dogmatic slumber, and you can see why once you. I mean, I've read a little bit of Kant, a little bit of Hume, and basically, Kant was the first. Well, what Kant did for philosophy, in his own words, and many people agree with him, including myself, was basically analogous to the Copernican revolution in astronomy, because Kant turned the idea of the world as it's perceived upon itself. He it's very much anthropocentric, in the sense that our idea of reality and everything else in the world can't be what it is in itself, because we bring something to it, which sounds like a simple idea when it put in that way, but he goes very nuanced to be really the first person to both delineate what is actually a priori or prior to experience in the mind, and what is a posteriori or after experience. And I've read some of the Prolegomenon before, and it's very, very exciting to me to read how he can take something like pure mathematics and pure mathematical knowledge and say, well, how is this possible? And basically reach the conclusion from his premises and his reasoning, and I think a correct conclusion, that it occurs from pure insight, being our intuitions of space and time, and this existing in us rather than objective space and time. So I'll get more into that later, and I'm probably just, I know I kind of have this self-consciousness, or the apperception as Kant would call it, that I'm sort of just babbling on very random topics for each philosopher and not really giving a good solid overview of them, because like I said, this is just more of a video to show what I'm reading and a little bit of why, rather than a review of each book, which I'm going to do in the future after they've already been read. Now next, of course, is Kant's magnum opus, The Critique of Pure Reason. And this one he actually wrote before the Prolegomenon, but he wrote the Prolegomenon in part because people were having difficulty understanding the critique, because it is in part obscure in places, and it is turgid, no doubt about that. And he works with what he calls the synthetic method with the critique, which is a little bit more, you have to really think through it. You can't just skim the book and expect to understand it. You really have to think through the work. So after Kant's magnum opus, I'm going to be reading Schopenhauer's On the Fourfold Root of the Principle of Sufficient Reason, which is a work that, it was his doctoral dissertation, basically, and it's heavily influenced by Kant, and it's basically the well, I would say it's the foundation, rather, of his entire philosophical system. It's the point, it's what you have to read to really understand the rest of it, his later works. And of course his magnum opus, his later work, is this, The World as Will and Representation. It's a 2-volume book, and I'm reading both volumes. And he at least claims in this book that he has discovered what has been sought so long in philosophy, being the absolute truth about metaphysics, ethics, and aesthetics. So pretty large claim, but I'll see what he has to say and see if I can at least take some of it and agree with it, or if I, repudiate the whole, or if I accept the whole, which is both, neither of which is probably realistic. I mean, I don't really see myself completely converting over to Schopenhauer's thought and ideas, or completely rejecting it altogether. I mean, in nearly every book that I've read, I've found something that I can take from it, some gems. Not every book, but in most books that I've read, I've been able to find something. And lastly, of course, I have Schopenhauer's most hated philosopher, Hegel, with his Phenomenology of Spirit. And this book is extremely influential upon the last century, the 20th century. Not exactly for good, but there's no doubt that the first half of the 20th century, at least, saw unprecedented bloodshed by regimes such as the Soviet Union, such as the National Socialist Germany, or Fascist Italy, and all of them, even though they were very, especially, like the fascists and the Nazis versus the communists, they were very different in their ideological constructs, their Weltanschauungs, as you might call it, their worldviews, but all of them were inspired by Hegel, which is a sort of a ironic in a sense because they were ideologically enemies, but they were all inspired by Hegelism or Hegelianism in some sense. Whether it's so, I mean, in Hegelian political thought, you have what's called right Hegelianism and left Hegelianism. But nevertheless, I'm digressing a lot. But this is more metaphysics as far as I know. So, the phenomenology of spirit, haven't read it, have heard about it to an extent. I have friends who've read the book before, and it's, I mean, like, it is, it's said to be the most difficult of all philosophical works, in, as far as known history is concerned. It's extremely abstruse. It's his way of writing is very peculiar, and his sentences are very long with a lot of qualifying clauses, etc., etc. He has a system of thought which he kind of expects that you know before you even read his works, and that's why it probably would have been a good idea to have started with his Encyclopedia of the Philosophical Sciences and Outline, which was a group of books that were written by, or lecture notes essentially, that were written by his students mostly. But I'm just going to go right into the thick of things and read the book twice, as Schopenhauer says to do with every good book. Read it twice and determine exactly what I think of it, and see if I can actually understand the thing. Hopefully I will be able to. Who knows? I guess we'll see when I get there. But as for why I'm reading Hegel, once again, influential in every system of thought, influential in, well, not in every system of thought, obviously, but his political ideology, or his political philosophy, extremely influential, but also his idea of metaphysics, extremely influential, and just his dialectical system has exercised a great deal of influence over much of academia in one way or another. So that's the first 8 books that I'll be reading this year, possibly the only 8 books I'll be reading this year. Again, they're not going to be light reads by any means, and I want to be able to not only understand them and read them, but remember, of course not remember everything, but at least remember the essential elements of each book before moving on to the next one. And I want to be able to give a lecture on them essentially before I move on to the subsequent books. So that being said, I'll leave off here. Hopefully some of you will be interested in hearing about some of these works in the future.